So we're here this evening to celebrate the launch of one of the most transformative healthcare initiatives of all time. There's never been.
At 9:34 a.m. On a freezing Thursday morning in Denver, Colorado, federal agents with the FBI, ICE, and the Department of Homeland Security stood before a packed press conference and announced what they described as the largest refugee aid fraud operation ever uncovered in the United States. Over the past 18 months, a criminal syndicate operating under the cover of legitimate nonprofit organizations had stolen approximately $117 million in federal and state refugee assistance funds. But the money was only part of the story. Federal investigators had discovered evidence linking the operation to human trafficking networks, fraudulent immigration processing, and the systematic exploitation of over 2,000 refugee families who believed they were receiving help. At the center of it all was a man named Ibrahim Yusuf, a 48-year-old executive director of a prominent Denver-based nonprofit called Frontline Refugee Assistance, a Somali immigrant who had spent 12 years building a reputation as a humanitarian advocate while secretly orchestrating what prosecutors are now calling the Frontline Aid Fraud Syndicate, a sprawling criminal enterprise that turned the refugee resettlement system into a personal cash machine. This is not a story about bureaucratic waste or accounting errors. This is about deliberate, organized theft from the most vulnerable population in America, refugees fleeing war and persecution who arrived in this country with nothing and were promised safety. And what federal agents uncovered gets worse with every layer they peel back. The operation began at 3:47 a.m. on December 9th, when FBI SWAT teams, ICE Homeland Security Investigations units, and DS fraud investigators launched coordinated raids across 9 locations in Denver and the surrounding metro area. The night air was bitterly cold, hovering just above 0 degrees, and a thin layer of fresh snow covered the streets, turning the city into a landscape of gray shadows and amber streetlights. Federal agents moved in darkness, their breath forming clouds of vapor as they approached their targets in armored vehicles and unmarked SUVs. The primary target was a 3-story brick building in the 5 Points neighborhood that housed the headquarters of Frontline Refugee Assistance. At exactly 3:52 a.m., agents breached the front entrance with a battering ram, flashbangs erupting in the lobby and sending blinding white light through the ground floor windows. Inside, federal agents found 3 staff members attempting to flee through a rear exit carrying laptop bags and file boxes. Within seconds, all 3 were on the ground in flex cuffs, while SWAT teams cleared the remaining floors. But the real breakthrough came when agents found a hidden server room behind a false wall in the basement storage area. Inside were 3 high-capacity servers, running encrypted databases that contained the entire operational infrastructure of the Frontline Aid Fraud Syndicate. Federal agents immediately secured the servers and transported them to the FBI's Denver Cyber Forensics facility for analysis. Simultaneously, strike teams were hitting 8 other locations across the Denver metro area. In Aurora, agents raided a residential home that functioned as a document forgery operation, producing fake refugee travel documents, counterfeit work authorization cards, and fraudulent Social Security applications. In Lakewood, SWAT teams breached a small office suite where 4 individuals were processing fake housing assistance claims and fabricating rental agreements for apartments that did not exist. In Thornton, investigators hit a warehouse that served as a central collection point for stolen goods purchased with refugee assistance debit cards, items ranging from electronics to luxury clothing that were being prepared for resale on international markets. By sunrise, federal agents had taken 11 individuals into custody and seized over 43 computers, 217 boxes of documents, 17 vehicles purchased with fraudulent funds, and approximately $860,000 in cash and assets. But the scope of what they had uncovered was only beginning to reveal itself. At 7:15 a.m., inside a secure FBI cyber forensics laboratory in downtown Denver, a team of digital analysts began the painstaking process of cracking the encryption on the seized servers from Frontline Refugee Assistance. What they found was a criminal operation so sophisticated, so methodical, and so deeply embedded within Colorado's refugee resettlement infrastructure that it had operated undetected for over 8 years. The syndicate's internal operational framework was codenamed Project Sanctuary, and it functioned as a parallel refugee assistance system designed to siphon federal and state funds while providing minimal actual services to real refugees. Analysts discovered that Ibrahim Yusuf and his network had created an entire ecosystem of shell companies, ghost nonprofits, and fraudulent service providers that existed solely on paper but received millions of dollars in government contracts and grant funding. The financial web was staggering in its complexity. Investigators traced money flowing from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Office of Refugee Resettlement, Colorado State Refugee Assistance Programs, and multiple local government agencies into accounts controlled by Frontline Refugee Assistance and its network of subsidiary organizations. These organizations had names designed to sound legitimate and humanitarian, like New Horizon Integration Services, Mountain West Refugee Support Coalition, Unity Family Resettlement Foundation, and at least 14 others. None of these organizations had physical offices staffed by real employees. They existed as legal entities registered with the state, complete with tax identification numbers and official documentation. But their only function was to receive and launder government funds. The money would enter these accounts as legitimate refugee assistance payments for housing subsidies, job training programs, English language classes, medical services, and family support services. But the services were never provided. Instead, the funds would be immediately transferred to secondary accounts, broken into smaller transactions to avoid federal reporting thresholds, and then moved through a series of international wire transfers to banks in Somalia, Kenya, the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, and several European countries. From there, the money would be withdrawn as cash, converted to different currencies, or used to purchase real estate and luxury goods that could later be resold. Forensic accountants analyzing the financial data estimated that the Frontline Aid Fraud Syndicate had stolen at least $117 million over an 8-year period, with the annual theft accelerating dramatically in the past 3 years as Yusuf expanded his network and gained access to larger federal grant programs. But the operation went far beyond financial fraud. Analysts discovered evidence that Yusuf's syndicate was also involved in exploiting real refugee families who came to Frontline Refugee Assistance seeking help. Communication logs showed that refugees who contacted the organization for housing assistance or job placement services were instead coerced into participating in fraudulent schemes. Some were pressured to sign documents they did not understand, granting Yusuf's network access to their government benefits and personal information. Others were threatened with deportation or harm to family members still in their home countries if they did not cooperate. Still others were simply abandoned after being promised services that never materialized, left to navigate the resettlement system alone, while Yusuf continued to collect government payments designated for their care. At the center of the entire operation was Ibrahim Yusuf himself, a man who had arrived in the United States as a refugee in 2006 and built a public persona as a dedicated advocate for displaced populations. He had testified before Colorado state legislative committees about refugee issues, received awards from humanitarian organizations, and been featured in local media as an example of successful refugee integration and community leadership. But the digital evidence revealed a different reality. Yusuf's encrypted authorization codes appeared on thousands of fraudulent transactions. His personal accounts had received over $12 million in payments from the syndicate, and his communications with network members showed a man who viewed refugees not as people in need of help, but as commodities to be exploited for financial gain. In one particularly damning email exchange recovered from the servers, Yusuf discussed strategies for maximizing fraud by creating fake refugee family units. He wrote about combining real individuals with fabricated family members to inflate household sizes and increase assistance payments. He detailed methods for forging persecution narratives that would trigger higher levels of emergency aid. And he calculated the optimal number of fraudulent cases his network could process before triggering audit thresholds, treating human suffering as nothing more than variables in a profit optimization formula. At dawn on December 10th, inside a Joint Task Force command center established at the FBI's Denver field office, over 400 federal agents assembled for what would become the largest coordinated fraud enforcement operation in Colorado history. A massive digital display covered the north wall of the command center, showing a detailed map of the Denver metro area with 68 red markers pulsing across multiple counties. Each marker represented a location tied to the Frontline Aid fraud syndicate, including nonprofit offices, residential addresses used for document forgery, storage facilities, bank branches where fraudulent accounts were opened, and government buildings where Yusuf's network had embedded operatives. The operation was designated Operation Broken Trust, and it involved FBI white-collar crime units, ICE financial crimes investigators, D's fraud detection specialists, EAR's criminal investigation agents, U.S. Marshal Service fugitive task forces, and over 80 Colorado state and local law enforcement officers. Overhead, 2 Black Hawk helicopters from the Colorado National Guard provided aerial surveillance and coordination support. At exactly 6 a.m., federal strike teams moved simultaneously across all 68 target locations. In downtown Denver, agents raided the Colorado Office of Refugee Services and took 3 mid-level administrators into custody who had been providing Yusuf's network with advance notice of audits and compliance reviews in exchange for cash payments. In Inglewood, SWAT teams breached a residential home where a former immigration caseworker was producing fraudulent refugee status documentation using stolen government credentials and official letterhead. In Commerce City, investigators hit a check cashing business that had been converting fraudulent assistance payments into untraceable cash for a 5% commission. Throughout Denver's refugee community centers and assistance offices, federal agents executed search warrants and interviewed dozens of individuals who had worked with or been victimized by Yusuf's syndicate. Many of these witnesses were terrified. Refugees from Somalia, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Democratic Republic of Congo, who had fled violence only to be exploited by someone from their own community who spoke their language and claimed to understand their struggles. Some had been coerced into signing fraudulent documents. Others had been blackmailed with threats against family members. Still, others had simply trusted Yusuf because he presented himself as a fellow refugee who had succeeded in America and wanted to help others do the same. Over the next 12 hours, federal agents executed warrants, seized evidence, and arrested 23 additional individuals connected to the syndicate. They recovered server farms containing backup copies of the fraudulent databases, financial records documenting over $90 million in international wire transfers, communication logs proving coordination between network members, and stacks of blank identification documents ready to be filled in with fabricated refugee information. They also confiscated 27 vehicles, 3 luxury properties purchased with stolen funds, and approximately $2 million in cash assets distributed across multiple safe deposit boxes and hidden storage locations. As federal investigators continued analyzing the seized evidence, they uncovered a level of institutional infiltration that extended throughout Colorado's refugee resettlement infrastructure. The Frontline Aid fraud syndicate had not simply exploited the system from the outside. It had embedded operatives within state and federal agencies responsible for overseeing refugee assistance programs, creating a network of corruption that allowed Yusuf's operation to function with impunity for nearly a decade. Forensic analysis of the seized servers revealed that at least 9 government employees across multiple agencies had been on Yusuf's payroll. These individuals held positions within the Colorado Department of Human Services, the State Office of Refugee Services, Federal Health and Human Services field offices, and local housing assistance agencies. They had access to confidential case files, authority to approve funding allocations, and the ability to bypass standard oversight protocols. In exchange for payments ranging from $5,000 per month to over $200,000 annually, these individuals provided Yusuf's network with everything they needed to operate successfully. They leaked information about upcoming audits and compliance reviews, giving the syndicate time to hide evidence or falsify records. They approved fraudulent applications that should have been immediately flagged as suspicious. They provided blank government forms with official stamps and signatures that could be used to create fake documentation. They altered internal databases to make fabricated refugee cases appear legitimate. And they sabotaged investigations by delaying information requests, misfiling complaints, and directing whistleblower reports into bureaucratic dead ends where they would be forgotten. One particularly damning case involved a senior program coordinator at Colorado's Office of Refugee Services, who had been receiving monthly payments from Yusuf for over 6 years. This individual had direct access to federal Refugee Assistance Fund allocations and had approved over $43 million in payments to Frontline Refugee Assistance and its shell organizations, despite multiple red flags in the applications. When questioned by federal investigators, this coordinator admitted that she had known the applications were fraudulent, but justified her actions by claiming the refugee assistance system was already broken and inefficient, and that Yusuf was at least doing something to help people, even if his methods were not entirely legal. Federal agents also discovered evidence that Yusuf's syndicate had infiltrated community organizations and advocacy groups that were supposed to serve as watchdogs for refugee assistance programs. At least 5 individuals working for nonprofit oversight organizations, refugee rights advocacy groups, and community legal aid services were found to be either directly employed by Yusuf or receiving payments to ignore complaints and suppress information about frontline refugee assistances activities. These individuals had used their positions of trust to discredit legitimate whistleblowers, dismiss concerns raised by refugees who felt they were being exploited, and create a protective shield around Yusuf's operation by portraying any criticism as discrimination or xenophobia against refugee service providers. The emotional impact on honest government workers and nonprofit staff who had dedicated their careers to helping refugees was devastating. Federal agents interviewed dozens of caseworkers, program coordinators, and community organizers who had raised concerns about Yusuf's operations over the years, but had been ignored, dismissed, or actively undermined by supervisors who were later discovered to be on the syndicate's payroll. One veteran refugee services coordinator broke down during her interview, describing how she had filed multiple reports about irregularities in frontline refugee assistance case, files only to be told she was being culturally insensitive and needed to trust community-based organizations more. Those reports were never investigated. Years later, she learned that her direct supervisor had been receiving $25,000 per quarter from Yusuf's network to ensure complaints never reached higher authorities. As the investigation expanded beyond Colorado, federal agents discovered that Yusuf's network had connections reaching into at least 7 other states in multiple foreign countries. The Frontline Aid Fraud Syndicate was not an isolated operation confined to Denver. It was part of a larger ecosystem of refugee assistance fraud that exploited the fragmented nature of the U.S. resettlement system. Investigators traced financial connections to similar fraud operations in Minnesota, Ohio, Washington, Texas, Michigan, California, and New York, all states with large refugee populations and substantial federal resettlement funding. These operations used nearly identical methodologies, including creating legitimate-looking nonprofit organizations, establishing shell companies to provide phantom services, embedding operatives within government oversight agencies, and exploiting the complexity of refugee assistance programs to steal millions of dollars while providing minimal actual help to vulnerable populations. The money stolen from U.S. taxpayers through these networks was flowing into international destinations where it funded luxury real estate developments, supported political patronage networks, and in some cases, financed activities that federal investigators are still working to fully understand. Bank records showed Yusuf had transferred over $38 million to accounts in Somalia, controlled by individuals with suspected links to regional power brokers and business networks that operate in the gray space between legal commerce and organized crime. But the most chilling discovery came from encrypted files that detailed what investigators are calling Yusuf's expansion plan. Documents showed that Yusuf and his associates had been developing strategies to replicate the Frontline Aid Fraud Syndicate model across additional states, specifically targeting locations with growing refugee populations and newly established resettlement programs, where oversight was minimal and institutional knowledge was limited. The plan outlined recruitment strategies for corrupting government officials, methods for identifying vulnerable nonprofits that could be taken over or used as fronts, and financial projections estimating that a fully national network could steal upwards of $500 million annually from federal refugee assistance programs. When federal agents finally arrested Ibrahim Yusuf on December 11th at a luxury apartment in downtown Denver, where he had been hiding since the initial raids, he showed no remorse. In a recorded interview that lasted over 8 hours, Yusuf defended his actions by claiming the refugee assistance system was wasteful and inefficient, that he was simply taking advantage of government incompetence, and that many of the refugees his organization supposedly helped would have struggled anyway because they were not prepared for life in America. He dismissed the exploitation of real refugee families as an unfortunate but necessary cost of doing business. He claimed his network had actually helped some people, and that this should be considered in his favor. And he insisted that government officials who took his money were equally guilty and should not be allowed to portray themselves as victims. The legal charges Yusuf faces include wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to defraud the United States, theft of government funds, identity theft, witness tampering, and racketeering under the Organized Crime Control Act. He faces a potential sentence of over 40 years in federal prison. Other network members face similar charges, with sentences ranging from 5 to 30 years depending on their level of involvement. But the damage cannot be measured solely in prison time or financial restitution. Over 2,000